Well, it's good to be back. Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me back. It's wonderful to be here. I think, though, next time before I agree, I should really be checking what the passages are beforehand in the lectionary. So I follow the lectionary mostly because I don't know who else is coming, what they might be preaching, so I just want to make sure I'm not saying, preach on the same thing. So we just kind of follow the lectionary, and I like the idea that we're all kind of in all over the world, that people are kind of wrestling with the same sort of text. But that means that sometimes I come along to a passage like this, which is very challenging, and it feels like, actually, that I've been getting quite a few of those lately. So I was thinking at first that maybe I would try to go with one of the other passages. But I'm also on record as saying often that when we come to a challenging passage, especially if it's being spoken to us from Jesus, that we really need to look at that and kind of wrestle with that. So I rolled up my sleeves and decided, okay, we're going to go into it again, and we're going to do another kind of wrestling with the word and trying to figure out what's going on here in this passage. I remember when I was sitting here going like, boy, what am I going to say about this? I actually texted a colleague of ministry of mine, Macy, and I said, boy, rough passage here, but I think I figured out what I'm going to do. What I'm actually going to do is I'm going to lead us in an exercise. I'm going to have all of us pull out our phones, and all together we're going to call the person that's our closest living relative, and we're going to tell them that for the sake of the gospel, we hate their guts. How does that sound? Do you think that will go over well? And I don't think so either. No, she wrote back saying, good idea, that's how cults are formed. And she's right. That's actually why we wrestle with passages like this, because they can be abused. I could say, hey, this is a test of faith. It says to do that, so everyone do it, or you're not a true Christian. And that cuts off your support network, it cuts out your friends. That is actually how cults are formed. So I decided, maybe I wouldn't do that. You're welcome. But instead, that we would take a look at the passage and try to figure out what it's actually meaning. Now, the broader scope of what Jesus is trying to say, I actually understand pretty well. That actually makes sense. Because he's in a time where persecution is happening. And I know Christians like to often be talking about how persecuted we are, but it's nothing today like it was then. There very seriously was risk. And remember that everyone who was moving into Christianity at the time when Jesus was speaking was leaving another religion. They were leaving whatever faith tradition they were coming from and joining Christianity, probably against the wishes of their family. And so what this meant was that very real costs were expected to be paid if you were going to become one of Jesus' disciples. That your family might disown you, that people might actually be physically violent against you. All of this was a very real possibility. And so Jesus' statement of like, hey, you might want to consider the cost before you sign up for this makes a lot of sense. But hate? Like, really hate? That's the one word in there that just doesn't make sense. The rest of it I can get. But to say that we must be willing to hate our families? That doesn't sit right. Does it sit right? Is it kind of wrangling? Okay, so it's not sitting right. That is step one of the process of deciding how and when we ought to wrestle with text. If you're looking at a passage and it's not feeling like it fits in the wider context of the message of Christ and of God, you're right to scratch your head and wonder if we ought to look closer at the passage. That inner voice that you're hearing that says, hang on, that doesn't seem right, is correct. It is time to ask some bigger questions about the passage. So that is what we will do today. Now, there's a lot of different tools that we can apply, but the one that's relevant here is when we talk about the meaning of the words in the translation. So we'll start by reminding you that we're looking at translation of the text, not just into English, but actually it's very unlikely that Jesus spoke Greek. It was more of a written language at the time, which is why it's written in Greek. It's the easiest way to transfer the knowledge through writing. But he would have spoken and preached in Aramaic, which is the language of the people. He wanted to hear it. He probably knew a decent amount, if not fluent in Hebrew, because he argued in the synagogues, but probably not much Greek. Wasn't much cause for that. So we get a translation one over from whatever Jesus was saying into Greek, and then we get a translation from Greek into English. So we're kind of like 2 steps removed in the translation. And so when we look at the words when we do translation, it's kind of doing our best effort with what we've got, but words can be kind of fuzzy sometimes. I mean, sometimes nouns are pretty straightforward. It's a cat, okay, in another language it's a cat, fine. But take a word like a shrub, okay? Well, where is the boundary between a shrub and a bush and a plant and possibly a small tree or anything else? Like, the range of a word is important. How much does that word cover? And different languages have very stricter or looser rules around certain words, and it might apply to a different thing. So a word shrub in English might be pretty wide, but in another language there might be a very, very specific word for a very specific size plant. Plant is a massive word. It covers just about everything that grows. But now we also have other specific words. Okay, so I bring that up because for a language that has multiple words for love, which Greek does, the word for hate, misios, actually covers a really big range. We can see that not just in biblical text, but we can actually see that in the other writings of the day, that this word carries a lot of weight. And you would need context and conversation sometimes in order to figure out what you specifically meant if you were to use this word for hate. How much do you actually hate this thing? In fact, it covers like the absolute disgust and hatred that we think of when we think of hate, that very strong, powerful emotion, down to dislike is also covered by that word, even though down to sort of this feeling of indifference, or I would choose something else if I could. Even that is covered in the same word. So to give an example, I hate, like actually hate, onions. Ever since I was a kid, nope, I see an onion on a plate, I don't want it. If you're gonna put an onion on a pizza, you just ruin the pizza. I'm out, right? So I hate onions, and I hate onions on pizza. Pizza with onions, I hate that. But now let's take one that's very controversial. Let's take pineapple on pizza. I actually don't hate pineapple on pizza. I also don't love it. I'm pretty indifferent. So if there were 3 pizzas in front of me, one I really, really liked, one that had pineapple, and one that had onion, I would hate the one with onion. I'd be pretty indifferent to the one with pineapple, and I'd prefer the one that was on the side, the good pizza. But in the Greek, both the pineapple case and the onion case would be hate. I would just say, I hate this one, I hate this one. And if you wanted to know how much I was choosing otherwise, you'd have to kind of push me on that a little bit or ask some questions. So there's a range that is covered by that word. Translators, though, when they're putting together a text like this, find themselves in a difficult position of having to provide theology if they're going to translate it in any way other than hate, because it is true also that it mostly tends to mean the stronger emotion. Mostly it does tend to mean that. Like 80% of the time it tends to mean that, historically. But 20% of the time it seems to mean something much more loose. So you kind of, when you translate, you've got to, 80% of the time it means hate, so I guess I'm just going to put hate here and let you all figure out what that means. That you will have, because that puts it's up to us to interpret the text as it is, which is what we're doing today. We're interpreting the text in the context of the wider scope and saying, well, maybe it means kind of a much fuzzier version of hate. In fact, maybe it means more towards you must be willing to choose otherwise. And within that context, the wider argument that Jesus is saying of, hey, listen, if you're going to follow me, if you're going to pick up the cross and follow me, there might be a cost because your family might decide that they're not interested in being your family anymore. You must be willing to choose otherwise. You must be willing to choose the otherwise. And in that sense, it actually makes a lot more sense. Now, the compounding piece of this that helps us with this is that we're looking in Luke. And Luke, of all the gospel writers, writers, uses the fuzzy version of hate more than the other ones. So I said maybe historically like 80% of the time hate means like hate. But for Luke, it's only about 50% of the time that hate means the hate. He actually frequently uses hate in a term that seems to imply a much looser willingness to work otherwise or choose otherwise. A much looser version of hate. Especially around, we see it a lot in issues of money. Luke will often say that you must hate money, and yet Jesus walked around with a coin purse, and the disciples kept a coin purse, and they used it to buy goods and services. And so there was a use for it. So the interpretation here then is that what he's saying is your focus ought to be on something else. You must be willing to walk away from that and choose something else, right? So that's kind of that sense that he is. And so that, to me, helps me understand that and what's going on with that. So at the end of that, I can now say, well, at least I no longer hate, that passage. But if I had put together the lectionary, I would have chosen otherwise. So there we are. In fact, what I would have chosen, though, is something much more like the psalm. And as we head towards communion, I just want to say a few things about the psalm. I even toyed with the idea of doing a whole sermon on that psalm because it's so beautiful. But I couldn't figure out how to say anything better than the psalmist said. What can I say better than that? It's stunning reflection on the power and the beauty of a God who formed us, who made each of us. And more than that, not just made us in these forms, but put into us this soul, this divine spark within us that animates it and creates it. The most famous line out of that is that we are fearfully and wonderfully made. It's a beautiful way to look at it, especially since we're talking about translation and the range of words. If we look at fear in that real big range, the way I like to talk about it is if you've ever been to one of those massive waterfalls and you stand right at the base and you feel the water is like slamming into the earth and it's pounding, you feel the vibrations through the earth, you're like, whoa, and your heart is racing because you do feel like, well, if I fell in, I could be crushed to death, right? So your adrenaline's going, your heart is racing, and yet you're taking in the stunning majesty and the beauty and the power of this. You're like, wow. It's that sense of this overwhelming wow is what the psalmist is talking about. That we are made with that wow element. Fearfully wow and wonderfully made. Of course, when we say that, we need to recognize then that applies to us. Congratulations, it applies to you. But it also applies to you, and you, and you, and you, and you. Each of you, fearfully and wonderfully made by the same God and the same hand that formed you, formed the neighbors around you. That applies to the people we agree with. It applies to the people we don't agree with. It applies to the people who have cozy homes, and it applies to the people staying the night under an overpass. It applies to the people who are citizens and the people who are crossing the borders. We are all fearfully and wonderfully made by the same God. The same hands formed us, each and every one of us. It's a double-edged sword. We recognize it for us. We have to recognize it in everyone else too, and live accordingly. In a little bit, we're going to do communion. There's a reason that we don't put a fence anymore around this communion table. There's nobody telling you you're not good enough and you can't come to this table. Who am I to stand between any one of you and the gift of God who created you? Right? This is your inheritance because you are made by God. Now that is something I can say amen to. Amen. We're gonna sing our responsive hymn, which is number 625. O Lord my God. You may stand in body and spirit as you are able. 625.